Chapter 13. Semper Fidelis Steve Byers, Corporal Rick Everington, 0331, 1st Platoon, Delta 14, 3rd Marine Division, 1968-69. Operation Purple Martin started on March 1st and ended May 8th, 1969. Location, Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam, in what was known as I Corps, the 3rd Marine Division sector, to defend against enemy encroachment into the south. Our outfit, 1-4, known as God's Chinese Fire Dragon Battalion, was there as human tripwires to alert the brass that the North Vietnamese army was coming down in force. Just across the DMZ were millions of true believer die-hard communists. We Marines were just a small speed bump on their way to Saigon, but one that had a ferocious, venomous bite and could breathe out hellfire. One of those bumps was a hill next to the Laotian border called Firebase Alpine, which was a freakish kind of place where the rarest of flukes could and did happen almost daily. It was there I clearly remember seeing stars against deep blackness, with small neon creatures fluttering around, chattering in chaotic unison while I listened to a tiny voice talking to me from inside my brain. My ears were ringing and painfully throbbing, as I heard featureless sounds from my surroundings as if I was underwater. There were some familiar noises of explosions very close. Awakening to a state of semi-consciousness, I could feel the insides of my head pulsating painfully, as if I had been punched in the face by a gorilla. Fluids flowed out of my nostrils and my mouth. There was the distinct taste of blood, my own. Combined together with the fervidly caustic smell of exploded ordnance, the sickly sweet, salty flavor turned my stomach. Peering through squinted eyelids, I could see straight ahead into the sky. In the distance were some dirty white clouds smudged against the early morning gray sky. It was a beautiful sight, but at an odd angle. Low and barely audible sounds continued to emanate from all directions, including gunfire, a lot of it. There was a moment of dead silence between the explosions, and it seemed like time itself had stopped. Aware now, I was laying flat on my back on the hard-packed dirt. Constant, dull, echoing sounds penetrated deep into my cerebral cortex, making it almost impossible to think coherently. My grip on consciousness was shaky, and I began to succumb to the drowsiness. I could sense my body was getting cold, stiffening. The voice in my mind started laughing. That's when I understood it was my enemy and had to be ignored. I had to fight to stay near the surface, awake, and above all, take a firm grip of my own panic that was running in fourth gear, burning through my life force. Panic, which can kill you faster than anything, and death are closely related. They should always be kept at a distance, especially in the free fire zones of Vietnam, 1969. What at first sounded like the moans of an angry thunderstorm raging miles away manifested into faint-whistling resonances. At first a low shrill, then louder, menacing reverberations tearing through the air. I tracked the sound until I could see some black specks that continued to get bigger, ultimately shrieking over me to kill some part of LZ Alpine. Yes, you can see mortar and artillery rounds coming straight at you if you have better than 20/20 vision, spiked with pure adrenaline. My ingrained reflex would be to dive for cover, but I was unable to move physically. My entire body seemed to be paralyzed. I could only endure as a spectator while the heavy artillery rounds shrieked above me by some 40 meters and slammed onto the top of the firebase. The extreme earth tremor vibrations reached through the ground and into my spine. One of the explosion's pressure waves nudged me further down the hill. Chunks of shrapnel whizzed viciously over, missing my face by inches. Dirt clods, rocks, and splitters dropped down from the sky and pummeled me. Dirt dust fell onto my face, burning my eyes with gritty particles that stuck to the insides of my eyelids, causing tears to form and then dry almost immediately. At that moment, barely perceptible, came the recognizable thoop, thoop, thoop sound of tubing from mortars. 3 tiny black dots appeared in the lower half of the sky, rocketing upwards to a great height, then appeared to stop in mid-flight, then turned towards me, arching gracefully downward one behind the other, whistling in with aggressive determination. I closed my eyes and prayed. Recollections of my life inundated my mind, all of it except the part about why I was lying out on the side of the hill. People, places, good and bad stuff can blaze through your neural structure when you're at the Grim Reaper's door. Like everyone else, I religiously prayed to Jesus and Mother Mary whenever I was close to being killed. I never prayed as I was shooting down the enemy, not wanting Jesus to know me as a killer. That's the truth. When in combat, you have to have your sense of order. In 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, our first prime directive is God. That name is labeled on the battalion shield along with duty, country, and corps. We always assumed that he was on our side. Our battalion shield had a green Chinese fire dragon protecting a pagoda which symbolized our duty to help the people of Asia fight the forces of evil. We were the good guys. The rounds thankfully hit and exploded on some other unfortunate designated target. Even so, the rounds created ground shock tremors that shot painful vibrations straight through to the nerves in my spine, causing me to temporarily black out. I don't know how long it lasted, but I was probably clinically dead, barely existing in the doorway to eternity. The painful throbbing in my head is what I became conscious of first, then the interior commotion of huge ocean waves crashing over me. Feeling exceedingly tired, the wish to rest was becoming paramount in my thoughts. I was going to let go and just fall asleep for a short time. At that moment, in the ghostly black void, I faintly heard voices. Through partially opened eyelids, I saw two dark figures with sweaty faces materialize over me. Somebody, echoing in the back of a long hallway, shouted, "Get the ammo cans! Grab his legs!" They pulled me by both cuffs of my jungle trousers over the dusty, hard-packed hillside as the back of my head raked over bits of gravel and detritus. It seemed like a very long time for the torturous ordeal to continue. The back of my head felt like it was on fire. I couldn't communicate or move. One of them shouted, "Mortars!" They jumped into a crater, hauling me in with them, causing my skull to bang against a rock at the bottom. Seeing shooting stars glittering once more, along with the awful pain, made me want to slug and thank these guys at the same time. Again, face up, I could see the growing black dots approaching in our direction. The objects were clear to me from my angle, approaching closer than over to explode up near the 105mm howitzer gun pits. Menacingly hot and jagged shrapnel zipped slightly above us due to the slope of the hill. More dirt clods, rocks, and debris rained down on us. Those guys were hunkered low in the hole, face down, and didn't see the beauty of it all. A freaky, fluky incident no one would choose to endure. I didn't have a choice. Relieved that the body lugging stopped at least momentarily, feelings of failure and uselessness crept over me, coupled with the need to rest, to fall asleep until the torment was over. Death thinking took hold of me. If I got hit, I wanted it to be direct and immediately fatal. No pain or anguish from seeing my legs blown off. I was too cowardly for that kind of long, drawn-out ordeal. I remembered a Marine on LZ Loon with his guts blown out. He wanted me to shoot him, but I gave him my last grenade, the one I was saving for myself. I know his name, but I can't ever remember it. I don't know what happened to him. We were being overrun, and I had to run back to my gun position without the ammo I was looking for. I have a lot of blank spaces in my Vietnam memories. Most of us do. Hell, sometimes I think Vietnam may have been just a long, bad, toxic dream. As I lay there, all kinds of bad thoughts raced through my mind, like I was probably crippled. I cried, laughed, and got angry, all in a single instant, used God's name in vain, then quickly begged forgiveness, asking for his mercy. After the explosion subsided, the ordeal began again. One of the guys pulled hard on my already banged-up right ankle, and because I was dead weight, it felt as if my entire foot was being detached. The pain was excruciatingly intense, and angry, wrath-laced adrenaline pulsed through me, and I emerged from semi-consciousness. I wanted to scream out a curse and strike out at them, while at the same moment there was an opposite urge to doze off. However, jagged stabs of agony kept me at the edge of the black well and not in it. Years later, I realized that pain probably saved my life, because it stopped me from going deeper into that comfortable dark space I was drifting into on that day, March 9th, 1969. Inflicting pain into a dying person can keep them alive. The running, tugging, and dragging suddenly stopped, and I was rolled unceremoniously into a slit trench, hitting the bottom, luckily, face up. The pain from the harrowing fall made me want to kick the guy that pushed me in. In a semi-conscious coma state, aware but not able to move or communicate, I was dreaming a nightmare. One that I could not awaken from no matter how much I tried. It seemed my body was not connected to my will. My eardrums were pulsating painfully, as the low blood pressure from my heart dimmed everything visible into pale ashen shades of gray or deep darkness. This reality had no color to it, making it all even more surreal. Vietnam dangerous surreal. I could make out some shadows of men crouching nearby, excitedly yelling to each other and glancing at me with wide, crazy killer eyes, the kind you get when there's death being shared around freely. Examining my surroundings, I became even more alarmed. There were shovel and pick marks on the greasy reddish-gray walls surrounding me, as if I was in my grave. With that claustrophobic thought, a sharp stab of newfound adrenaline stroked through me forcefully. It freaked me out so deeply my heart started pumping so hard and painfully I thought it might kill me. The numbness began to recede from my torso and then my limbs. The stiffness began to loosen up a little. Opening my eyes fully, I could comprehend that I was laid out on my back in a trench near a sandbagged bunker. The odor of human filth, dirt, blood, and exploded ordnance caused a reflexive convulsion to race up from my gut. I began uncontrollably coughing out copious amounts of acidic bile. Just in time, I managed to turn my face sideways for it to spill out like afterbirth onto the dirt. It lay there in a smelly, putrid pool surrounding my head. It was mortifying, but I finally caught my first full breath of air and could breathe almost normally again. A voice asked, "I thought he was dead." A shadow of a tall, lanky Marine drifted over me. "No, he's alive, just like I said." I could just barely hear what they were saying, but it was Steve Byers talking to Norman Beck, both M60 gunners. From the far right bottom of the trench, I watched as Steve to my left and above opened the M60's top cover, locked the bolt back, and pushed the charging bolt forward. He checked that the feed tray was in the down position, placed the ammo belt with the first round directly onto the feed tray, then closed the top cover with a stout tap to lock it down. All of it done in a calm, methodical manner, just like 1,000 times before. There was an explosion. Someone cursed and shouted out, "They're in the wire!" Byers moved the gun selector switch to the fire position and waited. He ordered, "Hold your fire. Don't give away our position yet. Wait until they get deep inside past the wire and can't go backwards. Then I'll open up." The gun idled on its bipod in stealthy silence. After an eternity of a long pause, Steve took in a deep breath of air while cradling the gun's forearm assembly with his left hand and the trigger's gripping handle with his right, took aim, then exhaled through his mouth while pulling back on the trigger. It's called the dragon's breath, as the machine gun came instantly alive, shivered gratefully, and commenced its soft recoil dance, belching out its opus of death. The whole side of the trench line opened up with gunfire. Even though my hearing was impaired, I could feel the cacophony of the firefight in my bones. As the M60's expended shell casings and belt links spewed out of the gun's ejector ports and dove downward ferociously onto my body and face, I had a flashback to Hill 672, when Corporal Bruce Arruda had taught me that technique. When firing the M60, you breathe out to focus your fire on target, and stop firing when you breathe in to let the gun cool and scan for new targets. You become one with the machine. Yes, it's a godlike feeling charged with adrenaline of the rarefied, purest form. Mesmerized, I couldn't stop looking up at the gunner's silhouette against the flat, pale gray sky. Hugging that vicious weapon, a beautiful young slayer of men in his hypnotic killer trance. Steve was in deep automatic combat mode, unconscious, immersed in his own personal kill zone world of sanctioned murder. Only grunt machine gunners experience this kind of psychological trance state of being while dispensing death in mass quantities up close, eye contact and facial recognition close, especially when near enough to discern the impact of your bullets hitting flesh and bone. You can't put away the memories of the hatred in their faces, and the desperate gasps for their last breath, or the recurring nightmare visions about how shocked and surprised they sometimes appear to be when hit, as if it can't really be happening to them. Up close, you may get eye contact for that last instance of life as they drop straight down into odd, shapeless forms. You remember those visions forever. The difference from a rifleman is that a machine gunner has a long belt of ammo and doesn't need to break his deep hypnotic kill zone spell when changing magazines. An M60 is a human death instrument explicitly designed to deliver industrialized murder with a touch of its trigger that is carried by boys, barely men. Steve had a skill which can't be taught. He was very good at killing the enemy and most importantly had the will to do it. Like me, he found he liked it too much. The killing of the North Vietnamese Army regulars was the easy part of the show, but we all knew the price of admission was getting terminated yourself, which was authorized and even expected. After a while, most machine gunners had their fill and wanted to let go of their joy of wasting other human beings designated as enemy, even those hardcore bastards that were also desperately dying to kill us. The hot brass shell casing continued to stream out of the gun's ejector port, descending downward to hit my flesh with a sting, then tumble into the pool of puke. No one noticed my dilemma. One of the casings fell onto my right eyelid, searing the flesh. That hurt enough to finally wake me up all the way. I sat up abruptly, pushing my back up against the wall. Brushing the spent shells off myself, I was feeling embarrassed, confused, and panicked when I reached out for my rifle but didn't find it. Managing to gather enough strength to pull myself up, to carefully peer over the sandbags, I saw a group of NVA soldiers gathered down near the base of the hill. Some had AK-47s, but most were cradling heavy canvas packs in their arms with fuses already smoking. Their leader, in a tan pith helmet with a gold star inside a red dot, started furiously blowing his whistle and pushing them forward with his cane. The soldiers began running through the breached section of concertina wire. Spreading out in a V-shaped formation, they continued on with determined faces, humping awkwardly up the cleared and barren slope straight toward our position. The ones with the AKs sprayed hundreds of rounds at us, causing the sandbags to disintegrate and bleed sand. Their bullets and tracer rounds streamed inches over our heads in green neon streaks, almost solid light rays. The The noise of the battle was painful beyond description. After struggling hard to get within 20 meters of us, Byers yelled out, "Beck, click it off now." The assistant gunner squeezed the Claymore trigger together, instantly igniting an incredible explosion. The excruciatingly powerful force created a blinding flash, tore through the ether with a visible shockwave that drove ball bearings straight through the bodies of the sappers, pushing them like rag dolls instantly backwards 10 meters and causing their own satchel charges to detonate. There were huge multiple secondary explosions that eviscerated all the dead bodies on the hill as the sappers' body parts were vaporized into a pink, disgusting mist that clung to the atmosphere in that vicinity. Hideously, some of their heads were shot into the air, looking like footballs being tossed for a Hail Mary touchdown. My eyes and face felt the heat, and I wanted to stop looking at the sight but couldn't. I was frozen in place, petrified. The sight was unforgettably horrific as we watched one of the grotesque spiraling heads land with a bone-jarring fleshy thud on its severed neck upright and facing the front of our gun position. It glared accusingly at us for a moment. Everyone froze, freaked. Stunned and speechless, scared, they stopped shooting. I was hit with a huge jolt of guilt and wanted to cry for it or him, for us. But as an eternity of sorrow seemed to pass away in a few seconds, I just got plain scared of it. Then, without warning, it may have blinked or twitched before it slowly commenced rolling backwards, eventually tumbling all the way back down the hill into the elephant grass in the ravine and completely out of sight. After a few moments, a gun barrel change was managed by Beck. Steve grimly fired off another belt of ammo into the general area around where it vanished. We figured he was trying to kill that head, but later said he was just trying to eliminate any possible hidden second wave camouflaged in the bushes waiting for orders to attack. Chalk it up to freaky, fluky LZ Alpine incident number whatever. I again remembered that I didn't have my M16 and reached for my .45. It was still buttoned up in its holster, securely strapped to my right leg. In that free fire zone territory, you always feel naked without your primary weapon being very close. The heat from my leg warmed the almost solid piece of metal, even through the leather. It's bizarre, but whenever I hear that Beatles song, I think about my warm .45 that kept me dangerous at all times. It was definitely a good feeling having it attached to my body as a secondary weapon. My hearing was still plugged up with dead eardrum tissue, but I could feel enemy mortar rounds hitting the hill somewhere nearby, and close enough that the dirt kicked up and fell into our trench in the form of sandy rain. When the 105s began sending artillery rounds outbound toward the surrounding hills, I decided to get back to my own bunker. Limping and crawling back towards the other M60 position under the artillery gun pits, I found my gear about 40 meters from Steve's bunker. Amongst a dozen deep mortar craters, my rifle was laying on the dirt, abandoned along with my helmet, which appeared to be wounded. Somehow the cloth cover was half blown off, shredded. I made it back with considerable effort as my right ankle swelled, then stiffened, and my throbbing head pain worsened. As the saying goes, my bell had been rung pretty good. I continued to feel as if I was submerged, mentally out of sync, and must have smelled and or looked awful because the guys were acting strange, trying to keep their distance. One of the brothers asked, "You okay, bro?" Another voice from outside the bunker stated, "Damn, we thought you was a dead mother." Before I could lay down to pass out, Doc Overstreet appeared, knocking on the bunker doorway as he entered our squalid little hooch. His thick glasses were taped together in the middle as I remember it, and he dropped a tightly rolled-up black rubberized fabric bundle on the floor. The corpsman always looked cleaner than the average Marine somehow, so he appeared official and began opening his medical kit bag while stating he wanted to check me out. I could barely hear his words, so I motioned for him to speak up and pointed to my ears. He said loudly, "I'm here to put a toe tag on a dead Marine. That bundle I dropped on the deck is his body bag." I stammered, "What the hell are you saying, Doc?" He looked very tired and then relieved. "The word is there's a body of a Marine on this side of the hill, one that laid out there for a long time not moving." I said, "I don't remember being hit." "I do remember being out there on the hillside." Doc, in his steady manner, replied, "It was reported that some fool running between bunkers was hit and blown 20 feet into the air, did a full 360, landed on his head, stopped breathing and moving. It was assumed he was dead, so nobody went out to retrieve you. But apparently, and at great risk, they drug your dead carcass off the side of the hill while the enemy mortar crews were using you as a sighting marker. Those two guys righteously deserve a medal. It's highly improbable that you are still living, unless I'm talking to a dead man?" The corpsman wiped his brow with the back of his hand and sat down on the sandbags. With a proficient method to his actions, he cleaned his military-issued glasses of dirt with some tissues, then his hands with USN antiseptic hand lotion and a strip of white cloth. I pointed to my right ankle. He nodded, then proceeded to carefully untie the laces and gingerly pulled my right jungle boot off my swollen ankle. There was one small hole where a piece of shrapnel pierced the laces and the tongue of the boot. After he slid my odorous green sock off, I could see a small round bit of metal that was embedded into the top of my foot. He poured alcohol on some tweezers and pulled it out, and handed it to me. I took it and flicked it out the bunker door. He found 2 other small jagged pieces further up on my calf. The wounds didn't hurt much and were not bleeding. He splashed the holes with some red iodine liquid from a brown bottle marked XXX rock ape blood. It burned so bad it caused tears to form, but I rubbed them from my eyes before he noticed. When he reached for his needle pack, I immediately motioned that I didn't want stitches. He smiled, then skillfully covered the holes with antiseptic salve, cotton gauze bandages, and sticky white tape. After examining and wrapping my ankle with tan-colored cloth strips, he carefully cleaned out the dried blood from my eyes, nose, and ears with Q-tips and water, doing so without causing further pain. He soaked a strip of cloth torn from a military-issued green towel with soapy water and wiped the dried puke from the back of my head and neck. He worked in a precise, skillful manner, worthy of any practical nurse. It amazed me that he had so much stuff in his medical kit pack. I can vouch that he was very good at being a corpsman. It suited him. He pointed to my eyelid, which was red and puffy, but I waved it off as being okay. He mentioned that I was getting bald on the back of my head and told me my eardrums were more than likely blown out. Pulling out a small glass bottle of Darvon, he handed me some and said, "For the pain. It's all I can do for now. Should get you medevaced out of here, but can't until the skipper can get more guys to man the perimeter." I really didn't want to go through the medevac deal anyway, with the hill bracketed with anti-aircraft guns. Screw that. Like everyone else, I hated being back at battalion with the lifers. He told the guys not to let me sleep for at least 6 hours because of my concussion. He started to leave, then backed up and picked up the bundled body bag. He looked at it, then at me, and kindly said, "It's rare that someone gets to see their own body bag." I had a slight shiver of cold reality shoot through me at the sight of it. I asked him where he was going next. Looking very worn out, he shrugged. "I'm going to get some Z's. It's been another busy day. I've already attended to 5 other wounded Marines before I came here. I saved you for last because you were supposed to be, well, thankfully not. Stay awake for a while." After he had left, I realized that I forgot to thank him. I felt bad about that, so I drank a full canteen of water while downing all the painkillers at once. Almost instantly, my wound started to bleed as I began to feel okay. Don't ever drink water after you get a few random holes blown into your carcass, because you might hemorrhage to death. I was glad the holes were small. Later that day, when they went down to repair the wire, no one could or wanted to find enough of a body to count. The guys from Steve's gun team did not report or mention the eviscerated enemy sappers. Screw that. We had already found out the body count was bullshit. A lot of dirty, stinky, soul-robbing work for nothing, and you could never get the smell of the dead out of your clothes or mind. Talk about a crap detail. There was no hot or even cold showers in the bush, so at all costs we discouraged finding enemy dead as a matter of group well-being and personal hygiene. We killed them, but couldn't find the bodies if we could get away with it. Anyone that had enemy body recovery detail once never wanted to do it again. Finding, collecting, and counting dead enemy soldiers after a battle was the ultimate bummer assignment. All of it done just so the brass can add to the score and pat themselves on the back. To heck with that. A Marine dead or wounded, we'd go to hell on earth and back to retrieve. Out in the boonies, and whenever possible from corporal on down, a dead NVA was something we didn't find or know anything about. It wasn't like after 5 dead enemy soldiers you'd be an ace. Almost all of our lieutenants were in on it too, but only unofficially, very seldom noticing our dead body blindness. We didn't need the burden of being tasked with carrying the smelly, stiff, dead weight of corpses around. Or worse, hanging out on some unknown LZ with a pile of rotting flesh, hoping the chopper that didn't want to come finally came before dark. Vietnam Jungle Dark is an unforgiving, timeless space filled with a wicked blackness that pervades those unexplored mountain ridges and deadly ravines. Sudden darkness always seems to steal unexpectedly over the country before you can prepare for it. Nights in the remote mountain jungle were always chilling, because that's when massive starved tigers came stalking you with a vengeance. More than just a few of us had terror-filled dreams of the night 2nd Platoon's radioman, Frank Baldino, began suddenly screaming as he was grabbed and carried away down the hill, his blood-curdling shrieks getting fainter and farther away until stopping instantly in mid-yell. A fearful, profound silence followed the screams. one that was absolute, the void endlessly deep. The only thing you heard was yourself breathing, scared in pitch blackness. Everyone was a coward on that hill in that death space at that moment. Going after a tiger in the blackness of jungle night would be suicidal. Then they shot off hundreds of flares the rest of the night, hoping to scare off the beast. This infamous Delta 14 USMC incident happened during the first Argonne Valley operation on November 14, 1968. The tigers out there did not fear humans. They were too hungry for that instinct. All their normal game had been spooked away by fighting, so now we were their prey, big cat food. God only knows how many unknowns were inadvertently left behind, wounded out on the battlefield, deserted. At their final moments, the end came as they met their tiger. Fair game, sanctioned and had no meaning. Just some freaky, fluky nightmare to be endured by some of us. A few weeks later, word came down that a 3rd Recon team had killed a 400-pound tiger in the Argonne Valley region. They even had a photo of the huge cat strung up with a rope to a post in Pacific Stars and Stripes. One of the most highly regarded Kit Carson scouts, a Montagnard attached to our battalion, exclaimed that he would not go back to that area of operation and quit. As he was getting on the chopper, he said with fear in his eyes and a scolding voice, explained that killing the tiger was going to be a curse on anyone going back to that area, including the NVA and especially us. Finishing the perimeter work detail, the man gathered up the remaining spool of concertina wire, along with the splicing tools, and turned to climb the hill. The old man suddenly appeared about 20 meters up the slope, standing straight as a statue, his arms folded over his chest, looking stern. Everyone froze in place, stupefied. With a hint of a southern but clear and measured tone, he projected out, "The first man that tries to salute me gets a firing squad in the morning. At ease, damn it. I want the after-action report in 100 words or less by one of you that can tell it raw. Now. And if I sense one bit of bull, this entire squad goes on night patrol for the week. Am I understood?" His face and body remained drill sergeant rigid like a stone monument. Only the lieutenant colonel's eyes shifted from one Marine to the next, searching for some misstep. The agonizingly long pause mercifully ended when Norman Beck, the newest guy in the company, stepped forward toward the commander. They both walked up the hill with Beck talking and gesticulating with arm motions to tell the story. That's Vietnam freaky, and may or may not have happened officially, even though we all witnessed it. We should have known that we couldn't get crap past the old man. Evidently, he was satisfied with what Beck explained to him, and we were off the hook. We heard the early morning incident was logged in as a hard probe from enemy forces, that it was scared off by extreme reactionary defensive fire. Luckily, there was so much sporadic gunfire interspersed with incoming and outgoing rounds at all times of night and day that it wasn't even a thing. Although there was the telltale nauseous burnt flesh odor that emanated from that section of the perimeter. Later that day, as the sun was nearing the horizon, and right after eating our sea rats outside our bunker, Lance Corporal Monty Montgomery, team leader of the Brother Gun Team, sang us a Motown favorite. I Heard It Through the Grapevine by Marvin Gaye with backup vocals by a couple of his guys. As soon as we started clapping, and as if on cue, a lone F-4 Phantom II screamed over our area and released 2 canisters of napalm into the ravine where the head had vanished, creating a spectacular, psychedelic light show. The oxygen was sucked out of lungs and bits of melting fireballs streaked overhead so close we had to run for it. Motown and napalm at sunset. Now that's freaky, fluky Vietnam at its core. We all had occasional night terrors of that skull on fire, glaring at us with utter contempt. Fortunately, no orders came down to find body parts in the ravine. The old man was old school, and usually never tasked us with that kind of work detail while out in the bush, like the rest of the brass bigwigs often did. He was considered too gung-ho for some of us, if that's even possible. For most, he was simply a dedicated, hardcore Marine in the mold of the old breed, looking to fight and kill the enemy whenever or wherever he could find them, and he liked to do it in person. The kind of commander General Davis would appreciate. I ended up staying awake that night, high as hell, watching the 105's 312's G battery working over the treacherous jungle hilltops and stream-laced valleys surrounding Firebase Alpine. Our M60 bunker was about 50 meters below the artillery pit as a hard point of protection along the perimeter. The phantasmagoric night was pitch black as usual, but I was close enough to hear the fire missions coming over the radio. Forward Observer Lieutenant Andy O'Sullivan and radio operator Corporal David Ovist sent at least 100 rounds out to designated coordinates of possible enemy activity that night. No telling how many NVA killed, if any, but there was intel on secondary explosions, so munitions were destroyed. Early the next day, we were outside the wire humping the bush looking for the sites that were hit, and of course the enemy, dead or alive. As usual, we didn't find any bodies, just blood trails, code for we didn't care to find them. The patrol ended up being a long one that lasted several days and nights out in hostile territory. In the company's column, 1st Platoon was tail end Charlie, and 1st Squad with Byers' gun team took up rear guard duties. The forward and middle elements of Delta Company had already moved further ahead on the ridge lines, one-man-wide animal trail. 1st Squad and the gun team's primary task was watching for spooks, the reconnaissance teams that would be following us. They always did because they had to know where we were in the environment, their backyard. They wore the jungle like a camouflaged stealth blanket and could move very easily in it. We wanted to make that a lot harder, especially psychologically. As machine gunners, we usually had our gas mask pouches full of hand grenades. There were very rare instances when you needed a gas mask, but almost a daily need for grenades, especially to counter enemy suicide charges or for setting traps. We 0331 guys needed to be especially adept at learning and using the best deadly tricks, even the ones learned from our highly skilled adversary, such as setting boob traps. Different from booby traps, these were insidious works of genius, ones that could not be detected until too late, incapacitating and fatality-inducing devices that would stick in one's mind for a long time were the type we maliciously endeavored to deploy. Using wire and black electrical tape, we mated a frag and a Willie Peter grenade together, along with a big green leaf for a covering, then connected the wire to both pins that were semi-primed to slide out easily together. One of the brothers climbed a tree and connected the gadget to a hanging branch and passed the wire down the side of the tree's trunk away from the trail. We carefully staked the wire down into the weeds to trip the unlucky ghost recon guys from North Vietnam. Fully priming the gadget's pins to easily slip out, he carefully slid back down the tree's trunk. The Devil's Cocktail is what we called them, because when blown the party would be over. Beck and Franklin dug a small hole in the center of the trail and half-buried some dirt-filled C-rat cans in it. The NVA would be suspicious and stop to examine the offering very carefully. Not wanting to touch the cans of food, they would go around it, and that's where the tripwire would be, hidden in the undergrowth. To make sure they would go that way, one of the guys took a dump on the opposite side, leaving paper and trash there as well to make certain they saw it. To avoid the trap, they would trip it and become the boob, a dead one, that died in agony. About an hour after we had left the area, there was a bright flash that lit up the lower horizon and then a loud pop and hissing sound from where we had recently passed. Seconds later, a blast echoed through the once silent Argonne Valley. A pyrotechnics display of ignited particles streamed out into a ghastly, surreal light show. We heard them shrieking. The fragmentary grenade had hurled white phosphorus splinters in all directions. The flaming shrapnel was sticking and burning into human flesh. There is no way to put WP out except by cutting and digging it out with a very sharp knife. We could hear them cursing at us in Vietnamese and broken English. Those screams and curses stayed in our memory for a long while, but also made us euphoric to have gotten some payback from all the times they nailed us. One of the brothers shouted out, "Fuck you, Vietnam." We all laughed out loud. A moment later, 1st Platoon's Lieutenant Gungy Gates came barreling down the trail, where we were bunched up and congratulating ourselves. He didn't like what he saw. He was angry that we broke the noise protocol. "You guys in 1st Squad, and especially you guys in the gun teams, are always jerking my chain. One damned mortar round and everybody's dead. Spread out and move out. Keep the Marine in front of you in sight." Without saying a word, we quickly fell in single-file formation. "Obviously, whatever mischief you guys pulled off worked this time. Don't push your luck." With that, he turned and hustled back to the 1st Platoon's command group, where his radio man, Lance Corporal Joseph Jody Calderulo, and the rest of the forward element awaited. The next day I was medevaced out while on patrol in the fog-shrouded ridgeline between Alpine and Argonne. Doc had put me on the list with the other walking wounded. My ankle was getting worse with use every day on the steep mountain pathways, carrying 400 rounds of gun ammo. I was conflicted on whether to get on that Army slick in the fading light of late afternoon, nearly dusk. The aircraft was waved off twice because of its shaky approach inside the mountain's rapidly expanding shadows. It was almost night when they finally ignited a flare. It came in too fast and hit the small makeshift LZ hard, bounced up and down, then settled into a shaky hover of about a foot above the stone ledge that had a sheer drop into the darkness below. Fighting the helicopter's strong downdraft, Doc Overstreet and another Marine had to help guys up into the open doorway. Being hesitant made me the last man to board, and as I put my swollen ankle and left foot on the skid, shots rang out from below and hit the side of the craft. Doc gave me a hard shove as the Huey suddenly lifted, then drifted to the right and plunged downward. It felt like we were falling, but the Huey stayed about 2 meters above the slope of the hillside, picking up speed. I feared that we were going to crash into the jungle below, and started praying while holding on for all I was worth to the edge of the doorway. One of the crewmen had me by the flak jacket and pulled me inside with an experienced hand. Face down, I kissed the floorboards of that filthy chopper as the turbine engine screamed to full power. The craft lifted level, then upwards, and we were gone. Days later, my x-ray showed a hairline fracture, so I got an ankle cast, which only lasted for about a week before I cut it off to get back in the field with the guys. There was a rumor that Delta Company had gone back to FSB Argonne to rescue a third recon team that had gotten into trouble there. No one believed that it was true. When I got back out, they had just hiked off the hill. Everything had changed. Most of the Marines I knew were gone, and the ones left were shells of themselves, hollowed out in temperament somehow. They weren't the same Marines I knew. I could tell that Delta Company had been in a hell of a fight, as bad as any the Marine Corps had ever fought, and came out winners. The cost was too high for what was gained, but the guys were shaking it off, and their esprit de corps was still intact. They would be okay, but it would be hard for a long time to get past the facts of what happened. The truth of the situation was that Marine grunts, the undermanned Delta Company, retook the same hill all over again, and against the same dedicated enemy that was well prepared and ready to die to the last hardcore soldier. It turned out to be a fierce, no-holds-barred battle to retake the abandoned fire support base located inside the jaws of the NVA's cracked 246th Regiment's area of operation, their deepest stronghold. 2 clicks from the Laotian border and within sight of the DMZ, this terrible, vicious fight was a straight-up face-to-face smash-mouth collision where the Marines of Delta Company overcame huge odds by fighting uphill against a dug-in enemy. Many men died on both sides, but Delta 1-4 grunts reconquered and took total ownership of FSB Argonne from the best that North Vietnam had to offer. 1st Battalion, 4th Marines is always the sharp edge of the spear tip in service to our country. This battle, which will remain unacknowledged, is a prime example of what the Marine Corps does for the country day in, day out. The replacements came in small groups on CH-46s, looking brand new and so terribly young. They had no idea what had happened, but knew it was bad. No one talked about Argonne to them. They hadn't earned that yet. Days later, as if nothing was won or lost, we were right back out there, patrolling the same hauntingly beautiful and unknowable country of South Vietnam, looking for the enemy, our worthy foe. I had 1 month left on my 13-month tour, so I was very short, but I stayed in the field, teaching the FNGs all the gunners' tricks. The smart ones paid attention, and they were the ones that had the best chance of making it out in one piece. The others would have it harder if they didn't take Vietnam seriously 100% of the time. I tried to stress that point as best I could. After Argonne, everyone knew that we, the 4th Marines, were leaving Vietnam, so it seemed as if there was a certain amount of slackness that pervaded the outfit for the duration of the deployment. The battalion's combat leadership was decimated, and the new guys in charge were too new to the field and the methods to operate in it. Maybe that was my imagination, but the entire battalion was never the same. How could it be? No one was allowed to talk about FSB Argonne. There was no one to write a definitive after-action report, so it disappeared from official records of the day. Lieutenant Colonel George Sargent, Petty Officer 3rd Class David Dwayne Overstreet, Corporal David Ovest, Lance Corporal Steve Byers, and Private 1st Class Norman Beck, among many others, were killed in action on Argonne. Unforgettable Marines. They were truly some of the best of us. A great loss for the battalion, and impossible to replace at that time in that place. I do have regrets. I never got to say thanks to Doc Overstreet for patching me up when I was wounded, and later for putting me on that chopper. None of us got to thank Beck for smoothing things out with the old man that day at the wire. Talk about freaky fluky. A PFC talking to a lieutenant colonel. I especially wanted to say thanks to Byers, a real friend that looked out for me. I remember him as one of the most aggressive M60 gunners in Vietnam. He always had the loudest and hottest gun in any firefight. Exactly what you want from a gunner going up against the bad guys. I remember him on patrol wearing Ray-Ban sunglasses while carrying his M60 on his shoulder and gripping it by the bipod. He was a pal to most everyone and never complained about stuff like the rest of us. I have one story that sums him up. We were out in the bush lined up, hunkered down in an L-shaped ambush overlooking a partially hidden enemy blood trail. In the moonlight there appeared 2 litter-bearing teams carrying wounded or dead NVA soldiers. The ones doing the carrying were very young women, teenagers or younger even. I could just barely see them in the pale luminescence. I took aim and was getting ready to fire and set off the ambush when Steve touched the hand of my trigger finger to stop. He gave me direct eye contact and nodded his head, no, the signal to wait. I was confused, but didn't shoot. The enemy body detail passed by and into thick undergrowth. I could hear one of them singing softly as they marched away. We waited for a larger group to appear, but none did that night. I never had the inclination to ask Steve what the deal was, and just chalked it up to nerves, something to mention at some later date. Sometime after, I understood what happened. We were both killers, but somehow Steve had already transitioned from killing for killing's sake to one that had mercy when warranted. After all these many years, I never think about the ones I killed, but for some reason I do think about those litter-bearing teams, and I still hear that song. Steve usually had something good to say about anybody he knew. He was a better man than me. 1st Platoon's Doc Overstreet would have been an outstanding medical doctor if he had lived. He had a likable and sincere personality that made you comfortable in his presence. A good man I once knew in a dangerous place and a time of insanity. He saved countless Marines with his focused professional skill at minimizing bleeding from bullet and shrapnel wounds while getting shot at in the middle of firefights. More often than I can remember, Doc was up at the front of the action, inside the kill zones of the heaviest gun battles, pulling the wounded to safety. Or I'd see him loading his patients into choppers as the bullets whizzed past and the mortars came in volleys to kill the aircraft. I know from my own personal experience that he tried his best to get us all home. In Vietnam, with our political leadership dropping out in midstream, abandoning us there without a clear goal, and as our own people turned their backs on us, we eventually lost the will to help a country full of good people that could not fight for themselves. Not one of us volunteered for that kind of disrespect and dishonor. No one is to blame for what happened in Vietnam, but there are those that are guilty of looking the other way when we Vietnam combat veterans came home broken in body and soul, psychologically adrift. There were too many of us mentally and spiritually damaged and saddled with guilt. What was left of our self-worth was fragile, easily lost in the dustbin of world history. Our country and the entire globe, for that matter, had already moved on to something a lot more epic in their minds, real heroes, the astronauts and the moonshot. They were winners, and they got a well-deserved parade, too. The America we blended into was one that forgave the draft dodgers and elected them to the presidency, as did I. For those that felt the need to leave it to us, we have no hard feelings. It's okay. But if you ever get the time, say a small prayer to those that didn't get to experience those warm yesterdays, and this moment now, and all the future happiness you will have from your tomorrows. Please don't forget them. They did the hard thing, not the easy. Hollywood created guys like Rambo that made them tons of money, while we couldn't get hired by managers who were distrustful or didn't want to take a chance, possible psycho case that would go postal at work. Can anyone blame them for being scared of us? I don't. But I am disappointed with the fact there was so much of Vietnam that was and is covered up. Was it right to keep the war from expanding and to give the NVA a free hand while ours were tied behind our backs? Maybe. There are no good answers to the Vietnam War. Undeclared. The best thing we did was to leave, and it was there we left our arrogance. That was a good thing. Of course, we had it bad, but the mothers and wives back home, ours and theirs, had to suffer the true torment and bear the heaviest hardship. The crushing ordeal of ordinary people, mostly invisible and unacknowledged, putting daily marks on the calendar and pulling hard for their child or husband to make it back, was never really covered by the media. The death count on the nightly news took a terrible toll, chipping away pieces of their hearts while encouraging the enemy forces. The North Vietnamese never had to collect and count our bodies because we dutifully published it, almost in real time. They, the ones in political and military control, weren't right or wrong, but somebody should have been in charge of the real message. The one about sending us there, not to win, but also not to lose either. How does one accomplish that in the face of an enemy that was willing and perfectly capable of losing 10 soldiers for every one of us? It turned out that their hardened leadership had ours already figured out. Our word was worth 58,000 American lives. What other country could have made that commitment to a people they barely knew? We really shouldn't have been there, but had to be. By leaving, we won by getting out of there. By winning, they lost a generation. Was it worth it? In my view, having lived it as an undereducated combat grunt, turning 19 years old on LZ Loon and patrolling the treacherous Argonne Valley, I can only say, I don't know, even after these many years. Perhaps there is no answer because the question isn't valid. One thing for sure is that we combat Marines from those unheard-of battles will never forget the grinding everyday experience of surviving our own personal Vietnam hell. All of us carry the guilty weight of making it through alive as if we won a lottery to escape from that tortured country. There, Megadeth visited those mostly innocent Southeast Asian people and their ancient land in a conflict that was a countrywide crime scene of the most horrific nature because civil wars are the worst kind of man-made madness. Unfortunately for them, there was much sorrow to yet come, as it wasn't until we were gone that Papa San found out what the war was really about. That being his family's rice field and everything else the village owned now belonged to the party bosses. Their ancient ancestors' bond of family, memory, and history, those time-honored traditions and connections were cut and lost forever. That's all in the past, and if someone figures out what the hell happened, don't bother us with your answers or conclusions. To us, it was one long, harrowing string of freaky, fluky incidents to be endured and had no meaning. Those of us that survived combat know that it was pure dumb luck that God endowed to the many, but not to all. To this day, I still don't recall being hit, only shards of jagged memory, of waking up on that hill in extreme jeopardy and almost dying during Operation Purple Martin. Due to the courageous actions of my stout-hearted Marine brothers, I was saved from oblivion over half a century ago at the time of this writing. Bad dreams of that body bag that was meant for me have finally dissolved away, but on occasion when I hear the sound of choppers, I remember landing zones of the past and the warrior spirits of my brothers forever on patrol at FSB Argonne. Semper Fidelis Steve Byers, Doc Overstreet, Norman Beck, and Lieutenant Colonel George Thomas Sargent. Rick Everington.